as I'm getting older, I see the same story told again and again, but this time it's a lot easier for me to see through the narrative, and it's really interesting to break down the psychology of how a government sells a story and an idea to its people. So why is the US so interested in Venezuela? Why is it happening right now? Let me explain. The news tells us it's about democracy. It's about human rights, the war on drugs.
The Maduro regime is not the legitimate government of Venezuela. It is a narco-terror cartel.
Nicolas Maduro is an indicted drug trafficker.
I announced $50 million reward for his capture.
But there is another story. The story's about oil and power and the war to stop China and Russia from getting control over the idea of what money will be in the future. And Venezuela is a very important part of this story. Venezuela happens to be a country with the biggest oil reserves on Earth, even more than Saudi Arabia. But going to war is very unpopular, so how do you sell the idea of war to people? And there's a couple different ways that the government does this. For example, if the drug war narrative doesn't convince you because you're like, I don't really care about that, then maybe an economic angle will resonate better. We're doing it to fight the socialists because capitalism's clearly better, right? But if that doesn't work, maybe appealing to your patriotism and your values will. We're fighting for democracy, protecting freedom, stopping human rights abuses, right? There's always some moral angle to sell an unpopular idea so that we can step in and fix all the wrongs in this world. This time it's not Iraq, it's not Libya, it's Venezuela, which again is a country that happens to be sitting on more oil than anyone else on Earth. It's also a country that happens to be very closely aligned with China, Russia, and even Iran, which are all against US interests. Because keep in mind, this is happening in a time when the US is losing control over strategic resources and losing control over dollar leverage. Every barrel of oil that goes to China, every shipment that bypasses the dollar, effectively weakens the influence of the United States. That's what this is really about. But the official story sounds like something you might have heard before. The president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro's regime, is corrupt. He's starving his people, destroying his economy, silencing journalists, and rigging elections, and all of that is true. Venezuela has collapsed. People are hungry. Millions of people want to leave the country. It is one of the worst humanitarian crises out there right now. But the uncomfortable truth is that that's not why the US cares. If this was about human rights, we'd see the same anger toward countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other places. So then, why aren't we told the real reason this is happening? It's because if you tell people this is about oil and controlling China's access to energy, very few people would support that. But if you say it's about saving people, then you start to feel good. It's an appeal to your morality. And Venezuela, whether it realizes it or not, is caught in the middle of a much bigger story. And that's the story I want to explain in today's video. So with that said, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andrei Jikh. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the oil. Now, before I explain what's actually happening, I want to first share with you the official story, and it's a story that we're all told about. And the goal of this video is for you to just understand that a lot of things can all be true at once, but some things are more true than others, and you'll see what I mean throughout the video. So let me start with what we're told, the official story, which is finally starting to be talked about. The first angle is arguably the one that's going to appeal to most people's common sense values, and that's the war on drugs. The US government says Venezuela has become a hub for narco-terrorism. Drug traffickers are using the country to flood the US with cocaine and fentanyl. Now, on paper, that sounds like something we can all get behind because that would be a national security threat, right? But there's a problem. Because according to the DEA's own data, almost all fentanyl in the US comes from Mexico, not Venezuela. And what does come through Venezuela is just a fraction of what's trafficked around the world, maybe 10% at most. In fact, you might even remember earlier this year, the president was punishing Canada for being a proxy of fentanyl.
The fentanyl coming through Canada is massive. The fentanyl coming through Mexico is massive.
So Canada is arguably the bigger offender here. But we're told that Venezuela is the new Colombia, right? And why is that? It's because of the way it's framed. Because if you call something a drug problem, then that's a small law enforcement issue. But if you call it narco-terrorism, then that's a pretense for a war. And once you declare a war, you do not need approval from Congress. You don't need evidence. You can just go to war.
On Inauguration Day, President Trump signed an executive order paving the way to label drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
So it's very important that the first step of any story like this one is that you have to reclassify the threat to a group of terrorists, not criminals, because that gives the US legal and political cover to launch operations in Venezuela and even allow drone strikes, which the US has also been doing. So step one, always the same. Create a boogeyman, call it a threat, and get the public to support the idea that this is about morality. It's the right thing to do, right? Okay, but maybe some of us don't really care all that much about the drug problem because it doesn't really personally affect us, so who cares? And that's why there's another narrative that we're told about, and that's the narrative of socialism. This is the part of the story that says, Venezuela is living proof that socialism could never work. The country collapsed because of corruption and bad planning and government control, and that is true. Venezuela has been through one of the worst economies in modern history. Their hyperinflation has destroyed anyone who's trying to save money. Their currency has become worthless. Millions of people have left the country, and yes, that happened under a corrupt socialist government. But here's the part I think less people know about. Because while it is true that socialism and corruption played a role in it, it is also true that the US never really wanted Venezuela to succeed because sanctions made by the US made everything a lot worse. Over the years, the US has imposed more than 150 separate sanctions on Venezuela. It did things like block its ability to trade with other countries. The US did not want it to sell oil, and it did not want it to access global markets. By 2020, Venezuela's GDP went down by about 30%, which is pretty much catastrophic. Now, while all of that was happening, the media was also showing us videos of empty grocery shelves and starving families as proof that socialism has failed and they need to be rescued. But it's also left out that those same families couldn't import food or medicine because US restrictions were there. So yes, it is true the Venezuelan government created their own crisis, but the sanctions made sure that they didn't have the tools to recover. But it didn't really matter, right? Because the story was so effective. Because I think it fits perfectly into the story that most Americans kind of already believe, which is capitalism is freedom and that countries that reject our system are sort of destined to fail. It's a really powerful psychological technique that reinforces that we were right all along. So when I hear politicians say, we gotta help Venezuela, it's sort of self-servingly a way of saying, we gotta save them from themselves. Again, it reinforces this idea that there's only one model left standing that could ever work, which is of course our own. Now, let's say you're like,